Yes, welcome to this very first event of the very first economics festival in Scandinavia, Kokonomics. So we are head starting now here with a seminar on what economics is, where is it heading, what questions should we care about, and then it will be more happening the rest of the week here on in the evenings. There will be two parts of this seminar now. The first part will be led by me. My name is Kvaløy. I'm here at the business school here at the University of Stavanger. And we will then ask the first question, where is economics heading? Do we have the right tools to understand the questions we are interested in? And then Cahal Moran, my colleague at the university, at the business school here, will run the second part where we ask what kind of questions are the most important for the economist. And we have been lucky to have some very good people here to come and talk about these questions. And in the first part, I just want to introduce those who are going to ask the questions, where are we heading? And it's, you can come up, Kalle Moene, Linneberg Eliassen, Cahal Moran, just to show your faces. Yeah. And Linneberg Eliassen here, he studied economics at the University of Bergen, and when he did this, he didn't. It was during the financial crisis, and no one talked about the financial crisis. And he was quite frustrated about this. Wrote a book called Hysj, vi regner, and he is now taking part in a movement called Rethinking Economics, and he will say more about this. Cahal Moran here is a PhD student from University of Stavanger. He is also a PhD student from University of Manchester, not yet. And he has written this book, The Econocracy, The Perils of Leaving Economics to the Experts, together with some fellow students at the University of Manchester. It has got a lot of, it has been quite influential and critically acclaimed by people like Martin Wolf in Financial Times. And it's also part of this Rethinking Economics movement. And then we have the festivaløkonom, Kalle Moene, with us. I couldn't take all your books and articles with me, but I hope that's okay. So he is doing research on inequality, economic institutions. He is highly cited and well known all over the world, and he knows a lot about almost everything there is to care about in economics, and so he's also the festivaløkonom, and you will see him in many events during this week. It was not clear to us who is really in opposition here and who is more the established one in terms of criticizing economics, and so we did some mental flip coining on who's going to start. And the flip coin in my head ended up with you, Roman, as the first one, and then Cahal as the second, and then Kalle Moene as the third. So first, Roman. Let me also say this first part here is in English. They have 15 minutes each, and then there will be a discussion afterwards between them, me, and also the audience. Then we have a break, and when Cahal Moran starts with Katrine Løken, Espen Moen, and Erling Holmøy, this part will be in Norwegian. That's after the break at like 15 to 2. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's great to see so many people. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Ola Kvaløy, and also Jan Inge Reilstad and Kokonomics for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. It's a very promising sign whenever the economics community is open to criticism from people like Cahal and myself. Negative criticism is always a necessary step for moving knowledge forward. It has always been so, and it will always be so. So here we go. Do economists understand the real world? The question is based on this book that I wrote last year, which Ola mentioned, Hysj, vi regner, Hush, we are calculating, with a slightly provoking subtitle, Why Economists Do Not Understand the Real World. The reason why I wrote this book was that I was studying economics at the University of Bergen from 2008 to 2012, which were the peak years of the financial crisis and its aftermath. But the financial crisis was hardly even mentioned in the lectures, and the same goes for the euro crisis, the climate crisis, and other relevant economic matters. So in other words, the most pressing problems in our time, which have to do with how the economy is organized, are hardly even topics in the economics education. Instead, we got drawn into calculating how Robinson Crusoe is allocating his time between the production of coconuts and bananas. Friday shows up, he brings along some passion fruit or kaki or whatever, and they start specializing in trading, and then we start to understand how the economy works on a desert island with 2 inhabitants. Now, even if this is a caricature, most of the economics education, as many of you will know, does in fact consist of abstract mathematical exercises with seemingly little relevance. And that's quite puzzling. Why is this the case? Another puzzling thing is, which is related to this, is why did we not see the financial crisis coming? And just to give one much quoted quote by Robert Lucas, who's one of the founding fathers of modern mainstream economics, said the following in 2003, "The central problem of depression prevention has been solved." And this was not just Robert Lucas, this was the general sentiment among economists. The financial crisis hit. How could we get it so wrong? So these 2 things, the peculiar education which does not see ongoing events as particularly important, and this theoretical impotence in view of the crisis, justifies asking the question, do economists understand the real world? And as proper scientists, we should always ask this question, and we should also try to answer it in about 10 minutes, which I will do now. So it will be crude, and I will give some extreme examples, but I believe it still points to a fundamental problem. Okay, to answer this, we have to answer 2 things. What are economists and what is the real world? So first things first, what are economists? And what we are really asking here is what it is that defines economics, or more precisely, mainstream economics. And this is a really important but a very difficult question to answer. Many have failed, but someone who doesn't fail is Professor Goethe Thorsvik, who in his introductory book for students, which is a great book, writes the following: "Economics is a method, not a subject." And this is an extremely interesting statement, because I think most scientific disciplines define themselves in terms of what they study. So, for example, biology is the study of living organisms, and chemistry is the study of the composition of substances, or something like that. But economics is not defined as a study of the economy, but as a way of studying stuff in general. So this has some implications, and the first thing is that economics can be used for anything in principle, but it also means that economic phenomena that do not fit the method cannot be explained by economists. Another implication is that economics is one and only one method, which means that all other methods, all other economic theories, and there are a lot of them, I'll tell you, that students never learn about, are excluded because they are inferior or unscientific per definition. Okay, this follows logically from what Thorsvik is saying. So now we have to find out what this method is, and this is a bit, I hope it's understandable. The best definition in my view seems to consist of the following 3 principles. The first is methodological individualism, which means that social phenomena, everything that happens in society, should be explained with reference to the actions and preferences of individuals or agents. The second is equilibrium fetishism, An equilibrium is the stable outcome in which no one wants to change their behavior, and this is the solution in the mathematical models of economists. And the third is formalism, and this means that everything, all economic analysis, should be cast in a mathematical deductive framework, ideally. So these are the three principles that every economist should try to follow in his or her theoretical work. So mainstream economists, they are people who try to follow this method. So in order to compare this to the real world, we have to find out what the real world is. I haven't had the courage to devise a three-point list for the real world, but I will point to some aspects that I think are essential and see how the method stands up to it. And in doing so, I'm using the financial crisis and fluctuations as a case, but you can also look at other things, of course. So, the real world. What is the real world? We are living in a modern monetary economy. And in a modern monetary economy, financial markets, banks, money, credit and debt influence both the level and the direction of real economic activity. So it's this we have to understand in order to understand economic fluctuations and financial crisis, and also affects things such as distributional outcomes. So basically, this we have to understand this to understand everything. So this is a pretty simple and obvious statement, and it's there for everyone to see that this is the economy we're in. So one would assume that economists would take this into account, right? So let's see. First comes methodological individualism, which is a good idea in principle because things don't happen by themselves, but because someone does something. But the principle has had some rather perverse outcomes in practice. The most peculiar one is something called the micro foundations of macroeconomics, in which economists model the economy as if it is inhabited by a representative agent, which means one individual. So that's individualism for you. In these dominant models, moreover, financial markets are only a means to channel finance as effectively as possible, so they have no fundamental role in the economy. Nor do banks, credit, or money play any fundamental role, and the level of private debt is not a major theoretical concern. What does this mean? This means that we are operating with an image of the economy as an advanced barter economy and bytteøkonomi, and all the features of a modern monetary economy are suppressed. Another culprit here is rational expectations, but I'll have to look after my blood pressure and move on. In short, we have failed So, next is, history teaches us that a monetary economy has an inherent tendency to crises and fluctuations. We all know that, but we have done very badly at grasping this theoretically. And this is where this equilibrium fetishism enters. So simply put, the problem is this. Economists presuppose that stability is the normal state of the economy. So we have an unstable economy in the real world and a stable economy in theory. And the main reason why mainstream economists did not see the financial crisis coming was they were lost in theories in which the economy is in equilibrium with full employment, where financial crises are a result of external shocks. Random shocks and financial crises are extremely unlikely events. And this is really, really strange, because it seems like we are simply postulating that the system has a tendency to equilibrium, to stability. And if it isn't in equilibrium, this is due to something that economists cannot explain. So this seems to mean that we are abandoning the task of macroeconomics, which is to explain why the economy fluctuates and why crises happen. So instead we have an equilibrium theory of disequilibrium, an equilibrium theory of fluctuations. So to summarize this in the words of economist Paul Romer, for more than 3 decades, macroeconomics has gone backwards. Their models attribute fluctuations in aggregate variables to imaginary causal forces that are not influenced by the action that any person takes. To translate, we have failed. Thirdly, we have formalism, and that's the insistence that economic analysis should be mathematical and deductive. And this is arguably the overarching problem in economics. Because the economy is real-world economy is an open and complex, continuously evolving and uncertain place. This can be hard to grasp with mathematics. And this insistence on mathematical modeling that has driven the theory into obscurity in the examples I mentioned. So just to underline, it's not using mathematics that it's a problem, but it's that we have to do it all the bloody time. Okay, so why do we have this formalism? And this is interesting. Mathematical formalism is inspired by the natural sciences. And historically, neoclassical theory, economic theory, was built on models from physics. So the individuals are atoms, and equilibrium is also a thermodynamic concept. And more recent developments in economics are influenced by harder sciences, such as information science, biology, neuropsychology, and medicine. So I suspect we have an identity crisis here. Economics aspires to be a natural science, and this is called physics envy in Freudian terms. But in reality, economics is a social science, obviously. So we are trying to squeeze the world into this box that doesn't fit it. Rather than choosing the method based on what fits the real world, we have invented a dream world that fits the method. So we put the cart before the horse, and there's that. We put the method before the real world. And that's also why economists explains it, why economic students learn primarily the method and not the real world. Okay. So in conclusion, I've touched upon some aspects of economics, namely macroeconomics and its understanding of crisis and fluctuations, and I admit this assessment is partial and should be broadened. But even so, the following conclusion stands. Insofar as economists insist on this method, we do miss out on important aspects of the real world and will continue to do so. Therefore, we have to stop insisting on using this method and redefine economics as the study of the economy and use all the appropriate methods available to do so. Fundamentally, I think we have to get rid of this notion of economics as a positive and mathematical science, because it is a normative and political science. And the profession needs to open itself up to all those economists who do use different methods. So in other words, we need what we call pluralism in economics. And this, of course, starts with exposing students to different perspectives and have them think critically about the key issues of our time, such as financial instability and environmental degradation. In my view, this is a very modest demand with low costs and huge potential benefits. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roman. Then it's Cahal.
Okay, so I don't have any slides and I don't have a nice controversial title like Roman did, but I guess you could call my talk, "Why is the economics profession so resistant to change?" So I'm going to talk a little bit about the sociology of the economics profession and how it came to be the way it is today. I want to draw on my experience as a student at the University of Manchester, as well as the broader currents within the discipline and some of the research done on this topic. So I want to outline how I see the profession as somebody who was initially attracted to the promise of economics, but who quickly became disenamoured with it, and so became a part of the student movement to reform it. As a budding student, your first impression of economics is that it's a tremendously important subject. The economy features prominently in the media and in politics, and the men who speak about the economy, and it is mostly men, have an air of authority about them, using scientific-sounding ideas like inflation and GDP, and doling out policy recommendations and forecasts for the future of the economy. The authority given to the economics profession by society is unparalleled when compared to other social sciences. And this impression is seductive. Economics seems to be an indispensable tool for understanding the world, and anybody interested in changing the world must have at least some familiarity with economics. And when you ask students from across the campaign why they studied economics, they almost invariably realise this. So they gave answers such as, I wanted to understand how society as a whole functions, I realised that those who understood economics understood power, or I had an infantile frustration over not understanding what the grown-ups were talking about. And so, upon entering an economics education, students are taught mathematical models, diagrams, jargon and statistics, which cements the impression of economics as at least science-like, if not a science. Most importantly, these ideas are taught as if they are economics, with little to no acknowledgement of criticisms of the theory, alternative theories, or empirics contrary to the theory. A curriculum review we carried out in the UK of 174 economics modules at 7 Russell Group universities, which are rightly or wrongly regarded as the elite universities in the UK, illustrates this point. 76% of marks in exams required no critical thinking whatsoever, with the majority of marks given for questions that simply worked through an economic model without questioning it. Of these questions, only 3% attempted a link to the real world. The overwhelming focus of an economics education is on learning a core set of mathematical models by rote, handing down the view of economics as a settled subject from generation to generation. This pedagogy both reflects and reproduces how economics sees itself. Research, summarised nicely by Marion Fourcade et al., generally shows that economists believe in the superiority of their discipline. 77% of economics graduates agreed with the statement, economics is the most scientific of the social sciences. 81% of economics citations are within field, compared to 50 to 60% for other social sciences. Whereas most social scientists believe that interdisciplinary knowledge is better than knowledge from a single discipline, most economists disagree. And finally, economics itself is very hierarchical, with the top 5 economics departments accounting for a disproportionate number of publications in top journals, and the top journals themselves wielding a disproportionate influence over the discipline. There is an interesting contrast between this state of affairs and the early outlook of prominent economic institutions. When the British Economic Association, which is now the Royal Economic Society, was founded in 1891, they stated that they were open to all schools and parties, and the most opposite doctrine may meet here as on a fair field. Similarly, the early American Economic Association committed itself to the study of the actual conditions of economic life and to the encouragement of perfect freedom of discussion. Several factors conspired to end this early commitment to pluralism. The first was that accepting economics as a contested subject meant economists had less influence than they would like. In 1902, Irving Fisher bemoaned that economists have altogether too little influence. They are too silent on public questions, and when they do speak, their opinion commands less respect than it deserves. From outside the discipline, politicians such as Winston Churchill famously lamented that if you put 2 economists in a room, you get 2 opinions. There was therefore impetus from both inside and outside the discipline to create a unified framework to increase the political influence of economics. The second factor, which Roman was talking about, was the internal drive to utilise mathematics in a similar way to the physical sciences. So the late 19th century saw the marginal revolution give birth to concepts such as utility, demand and supply and equilibrium, which are all still staples of economics today. Alfred Marshall's textbook Principles unified these new ideas and became the first universal economics text. Though Marshall himself was somewhat sceptical of mathematics, this text saw maths and diagrams replacing what had previously been wordy tracts combining economics, philosophy, history and politics. And a final factor was the Red Scare during the Cold War, which led to the outright blocking of research deemed to be too left-wing or radical. The American Economic Association was actually initially founded as a radical organisation, but the implications of this were deemed to be too unsavoury, and so professionalisation became the guiding light of the organisation. So in 1922, the then head of the American Economics Association, John Dewey, felt confident in declaring that economics had abandoned the controversial stages and begun to work under the cooperation of investigation and analysis. In 1932, Lionel Robbins offered a new definition of economics as the science that studies human behaviour as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. And this stuck as the touchstone definition of the subject and still does to this day. Over the course of the 20th century, this homogenisation only increased, with journal rankings sometimes solidified by governments, as with the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, becoming sacrosanct, reproducing a homogenous idea of what it meant to do economics. This led to a process of attrition of non-mainstream economists from economics departments, with those such as the feminist economist Diane Elson at the University of Manchester realising that their work was no longer acknowledged by their colleagues and slowly moving on. Of course, this process has not gone without dissenters. Over the years, several groups, including a plea for pluralism in 1992 signed by 44 leading economists, have questioned this intellectual monoculture. In the year 2000, French PhD students launched a campaign, and their concerns were echoed by students in Cambridge, UK, culminating in what is now called the Real World Economics Association, a centre for non-mainstream thought. More recently, student groups from across the world have independently come to the conclusion that their education, and quite possibly economics as a discipline, is not fit for purpose. Roman has already given you a great breakdown of some of these arguments, so what I instead want to focus on is how the discipline has reacted to our challenge. The picture painted by researchers such as Fourcade et al. Is one of an insular, overconfident and hierarchical discipline. How does this square with our experience as students challenging the economics department at Manchester? And I actually want to defend economists, which is rare, but I think that this kind of image can be overstated. My experience of economists is as friendly, helpful people who are open about the limits of their discipline. Indeed, student groups from across the world always report that they have friendly and constructive relationships with their departments. Many lecturers and heads of teaching have been willing to make at least some changes to the curriculum in response to our campaign. There is, however, a crucial caveat. Economists are open to criticism and dialogue up to a point. And that point is where there is a substantial challenge to the mainstream approach. I have repeatedly found that it is not too difficult to convince economists that the curriculum should contain more real-world applications, history, empirics, essays and presentations. It is also not too difficult to persuade economists, especially after Brexit, of the need for better public education in economics. And though these changes would be welcome, the common theme is that none of them fundamentally alter the core framework and worldview of mainstream economics, outlined by Roman earlier. Real-world applications are to be solely applications of mainstream economics. Empirics concerns the application of cutting-edge econometric methods, and public education is thought to be a one-way street, persuading the public that economists are right rather than engaging them in a two-way dialogue. The dominant response of the mainstream to the calls for reform, known as the core textbook, is a case in point. This is an online textbook which has become increasingly popular and has been adopted by universities around the world. It aims to ground economics in a more historical background, using real-world examples to illustrate theory. But the essence remains the application of mainstream models, with everything from technological displacement in the Industrial Revolution to financial crises illustrated with familiar diagrams of intersecting curves. The notion that there may be other ways of doing economics remains, as always, largely absent. I would argue that this collective response of the profession is a consequence of the education outlined earlier. By teaching only one type of economics uncritically, economics education leaves its practitioners not only unwilling, but unable to consider alternative approaches. Any call for reform must be recast in a way that retains the mainstream. Thus, the image of mainstream economics as superior is implicit in the refusal to acknowledge pluralism. despite what can seem like a genuine commitment to reform from economists. And other social scientists who routinely practice pluralism are perplexed by this, because surely the inclusion of other types of economics can only lead to a fruitful exchange of ideas. After initially feeling anger and frustration with my education, I too have become perplexed at the resistance to pluralism. There are systemic and institutional barriers to reform that are the fault of no individual economist, true, but reform attempts such as CORE could easily have gone much further. So too would admitting even one or two non-mainstream economists to departments to enable a more flexible education. However, there are some positive signs, largely from outside academia. Institutions such as the Bank of England and Government Economic Service in the UK have been keen to promote pluralism and democratic dialogue about economics, hosting events and seminars which sometimes directly involve the student groups. Recently, a new initiative called Rebuilding Macroeconomics has been funded directly by institutes in the UK, and though it is still in its infancy, so we have yet to see how radical it will be. But all in all, I can only hope that academic economics will reach out to these initiatives to precipitate a new era of pluralist dialogue. Thank you.
Yeah, nice to be here. I'm very glad to be invited and very glad to be part of the critical gang, the gang of three. So I like that. Of course, when I come in the end, I don't think it was a little bit cheating with the lottery here, because I think they wanted me to be a little bit more defensive since I'm oldest of the three. But I think many people working in economics are much more critical than their reputation seems to indicate. I was a student in the 70s, that means the 1970s. And there was a movement just like this, not as well organized as these guys. For example, Sam Bowles, that you mentioned here from CORE project, he was a member of a union of radical economists. This is the one that wasn't radical enough in the CORE project, the textbook free online. I think people should investigate this book, because I think it's much better than what was just described. So that was a movement in the UK, and there were similar things in countries in Europe, and also in Oslo, where I was a student. So what we were concerned about is that the discipline was sort of dominated by a bombastic attitude to individualism. So there were no sort of collective movement in societies. They didn't understand. This was it was an obsession, just as these guys have said, by sort of a particular form of equilibrium theory, and there was also a sort of absence of history. There was no history. We didn't understand history the way we were taught economics. In my view, there has been tremendous change since then. Not in the sense that everybody had moved together in the same direction and changed in the same manner, but people are moving all over the place, and they change a lot. And I will give you a little bit of examples. Let me just, nevertheless, comment a little bit on the two presentations. I really admire these guys. They stand up, but when they finish their PhD, and they are there almost, on average, I think they are there, then, of course, then the quest is not for new things. It is with the contributions. We're going to see it. Come on. Criticism is one thing, but see the new things. Rethinking economics, come on, we want to have it. But I would support them completely in the criticism of the economic education. I think it is too many short courses, too much the math exam again and again and again, and it is too much exams in the sense that people never think through what they are studying, and they don't see the connection between things. So I'm much more in favor and in opposition in my own department in sort of forcing home exams for students for a week, things like that, and also to try to teach things as good as I can, where things hangs together more. Two more comments, and then I will say what some examples where economics is sort of moving in all kind of directions. Robinson Crusoe is often mentioned that this is the how bad economics are. Look at, so they inspired by Robinson Crusoe. But it's the other way around. The author of the book Robinson Crusoe was Daniel Defoe. He was a prominent economist in the 1700s. See, he was at the same time as Adam Smith. He wanted to illustrate the connections between savings and investments, and therefore he placed Robinson Crusoe on an island alone. It wasn't that the economists became inspired by it, but he wanted to illustrate something that was already there. He himself, Daniel Defoe, he wrote very influential books about consumerism in the British society, how this led to slavery on the Caribbean islands, the demand for sugar. So he was really a good guy. And it should be emphasized much more, and you should read him. He's a very good economist. Secondly, so the lack of, we are living in a financial economy and we don't study financial economy. So who are we? So the majority in the world, including Daniel Defoe, he almost went bankrupt, by the way, but the majority in the world have no financial markets. They have no access to it. And then you really understand how bad that is one of the worst situations. So I've done some studies in Kibera in Kenya. In the slum, there's a big slum, 600,000 people. The police don't even enter into the area. So we study how financial institutions emerge by sort of self-help groups in the slum. Very interesting, but you also understand better the role of financial markets and how they have been destroyed by sort of being occupied by tycoons in recent years. So I disagree enormously to this, that economists don't study these other things, the real world. In development, for example, that I'm interested in, people investigate the war in Afghanistan, use economic models if needed, but it's not, it doesn't have to do that. A project that I'm involved in, we looked at the economic consequences for opium cultivation, for example, of the war itself, the different events. So I really think that there have to be in part of the criticism, there has to be a description. What are people doing? And I agree that this is not sort of dominating enough in the teaching economics, but I think that it is more of it in economic research, both when it comes to financial markets and to study the absence of it, and developing issues, for example. That's really where the action is. I think it's a little bit of this criticism obsessed by this small part of the world that we consider the rich world, but important enough. And I think I would add to the things that you are saying, that institutions are very important for the study of economics, and we have to teach and understand the institutions. But the reason why we can't only do that is that we have to teach students something they can use, hopefully, when they go out in the real world, combined with the orientation about the real world. And maybe there's too little of that orientation in the lecturing or teaching or economics, but it can easily be fixed. And there are many people you can ally with. I think people are helpful in this. They want to help. But if you always be met with this, that you have to rethink economics, you have to rethink, and if two curves cross, then you are really fucked up, because that's the worst thing that can happen to you, that you have two curves cross. Let me give you an example of a general equilibrium insight in economics that can easily be extended. In the world, everywhere, developing countries and rich countries, those who have the goal, they rule. That is the general principle. There's $1, one vote in a sense, or 1 kilogram of gold, one vote. So those who have the gold, they rule. And those who rule get the gold. That's a general equilibrium. And this is a very forceful approach to study misuse of power, the misrepresentation of common interest, how these things are. But they are equilibria. They are an equilibrium. This is an equilibrium, and it is an equilibrium that's very difficult to change. And should we say, oh, we can't study an equilibrium because then, oh no, that's very bad, because we have a long list of things we never can touch. Of course, this is very forceful criticism of modern political economy in practice. And this can be extended in many, many, many ways, how you have reinforcement mechanism. And my criticism of economics will go that direction. So let's emphasize how things can go basically wrong. And then I will use whatever can help me in doing that. Equilibrium models, game theory, mathematical models, but not as a goal in itself, but as something that can help you in doing some of these investigations. We are not there yet, but it's much more of a pluralism already that we can play on. And we can sort of, and those who don't want to join in a new modern pluralist world, well, bad for them. But that should be the approach. Not, I think what has been now the critical movement, they replace themselves as the sort of the religious group of rethinking economics, and all the others are bad guys. I think that is basically a wrong approach to improvements in economics. And there are much more critical people. Let me give you one example. General equilibrium theory is often, something that they start the criticism of, and I think that's for good reasons. And very often they think that those who work with models like that, they defend status quo. That is something that's it's a bad word, but we can describe it in a nice way. It's a rose painting. This is part of the tradition. Harmony. Nobody starve in general equilibrium. They do. They die even in general equilibrium. So there is this attitude that people who work with these models defend status quo, the present institution. Let's go historically about it. Walras, and his name is pronounced that way because he came from Switzerland. So Walras, he was a socialist. He was the founding father of some of these schemes. So he didn't believe in the descriptive value of these models, but he wanted to solve them because he thought it was useful for some other things. He was a defender of cooperatives in his own time. Take Kenneth Arrow, who made a modern version of general equilibrium theory. He himself said, I'm a socialist. I'm a socialist, he said, and when I studied economics in the 30s, we all became socialists, and so he can't think in the description of power, misuse of power, and whatever. He can't think that the descriptive value of general equilibrium is something that they apply to the world. But in some instances, maybe this is useful, but I think he really solved some of these things because he was intellectually interested in how it was. And he's a very extremely good economist. I think everybody agreed to that. And take, for example, Leif Johansen. He was the first to use general equilibrium models for planning purposes. It's called the MSG model. Some part of this is a text in the Bureau of Statistics these days. That was his doctoral dissertation, actually. He was a member of the Communist Party. So he wasn't involved in it. He thought this was a useful concept. And all these guys, so smart as they are, they can't be so stupid that they were cheated. So I think this is a useful tool for certain things. I think Erling Holmøy, the best guy in Norway in applying general equilibrium models here, I don't think he is think that this has a descriptive value of how you should interpret the world, but it's useful for certain things, and we can discuss. It's so precise that it can be wrong, and that is a good statement. Precise enough to be wrong. Very much of the alternatives are not precise enough to be wrong. Let me stop by saying that I'm a really defender of general equilibrium, but I would like to have a new sort of general equilibrium. And the new sort, that is where politics are determined by general equilibrium forces. They react to the economic surroundings, how inequality our society. Those who have the rule get the gold, and those who have the gold get the rule. That is one example of that, and it can be extended much more broadly, of course. And to understand how politics emerges endogenously of the forces in society, there are approaches in economics that take that way of thinking, and I think it has been a good. Some progress has been made on this, even mathematical models of it, but that's not necessarily in all contexts, of course. So and preferences. We take preferences as given. Everybody here knows that when you change your mind very often and you sort of you get new things and you learn from experiences, that's too much of given preferences in economics. I think that is an important methodological weakness of textbook economics. But here again, there's a lot of things happening. There are many people working on this, how preferences become endogenous. There's very much individualism in economics, that sort of people are sort of pity bourgeoisie. They buy a sofa and they're aspiring to move up in the to rich areas, so they buy a little too big sofa. So they are aspiring to a bigger flat or a bigger house. This is the people in economics textbooks, they are very greedy. They're counting the money twice every day, and they're not very nice to go to a bar with. They are basically very boring to go to a bar with. But there are changes to this. There are people who are more human. They are reciprocal. They interact with other people. And there's a research program on that. Many people are interested in this. And there are also this that you make aspirations for yourself. You want to climb a mountain, and the reward is not anything monetary reward. The reward is that self-signaling. I made it. Hooray! I solved the problem. I came up. I didn't cheat at all. There are a lot of these things going on. It's not dominant, but I think it's in the criticism of economics and in the discussion of economics. These are the things that should be emphasized, not again and again the same things. I think I used up my time, but I'm happy to come back to some of these examples later.
Thank you so much, all the three of you. I think you can sit over here, and then we can talk a bit more and also take questions from the audience.
Skal vi stå eller skal vi?
Yeah, you can stand up. That's okay. Since Kalle was allowed to kind of comment on your things, I also think you should also start with commenting what Kalle said now. So maybe Roman, you first.
Yeah. To sit down and respect the professor. I want to give Kalle Moene some credit, first of all, because I know that after we started rethinking economics, he has now started teaching a course on economic history and inequality at the University of Oslo. And also recently in the last issue of Samfunnsøkonomen, or an issue this year, you wrote what I would deem a heterodox paper, where he's writing that no, the real world, competition in the real world isn't really like it is in the models that we have in the textbooks. So we have something to work on there. So first I want to you talk about this criticism from the 70s, and this is a political criticism that you were part of back in the days, and this is not the criticism that we are launching. So whatever Valra was a socialist and all these kind of examples, it really has got nothing to do with what we're talking about. We're talking about economics as a science and how it studies the world. Whether it's so the political aspect is not central here. Another thing is that there is an important distinction between theoretical pluralism and methodological pluralism. Now, what does that mean? I said that the method of economists can be used for basically anything at all, and economists do, like you had many examples of, but it's all using the same method. So there's no methodological pluralism. There's no other way of looking at the world, but you do have theoretical pluralism. That's very obvious, and also you can study opium war in Afghanistan, and as an economist think that this is an important thing that economists should study. So there are a lot of examples that economists study things that really have nothing to do with the economy, like how nomadic tribes treat their elderly and how much they eat and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, that's that.
Okay, I can maybe
okay.
also ask Cahal. So you said that economists are kind of resistant to change. Is that mainly, and also now when you heard Kalle was talking, do you think it's mainly in how we teach economics, or more also how it is conducted by researchers?
There are pockets of research in economics that's really valuable. I mean, there's a point of clarification here, really, as well as what Roman said, which is absolutely right about the difference between political and intellectual radicalism, is that rethinking have never said that all of mainstream economics is wrong and we should abandon it all. What we're calling for is pluralism, which means mainstream economics as well. And, I can name quite a few things in mainstream economics that I actually think work really well. The question is just, does it work well for absolutely everything? And I think what you see often is some quite interesting topics being studied by economists. But let me give you an example. Economic history has recently come back in the form of something called clear metrics, which is basically trying to construct data for a very, very long time ago and using econometrics on it to try and say things statistically. Now, that's really the main way in which economists study history. And you can study history that way, but you could also study it more qualitatively in the way that historians do. And that kind of methodological pluralism remains absent, even at the research level.
Okay, you would comment, Kalle?
Yes, I just speak better to understand. I think this. I know a little bit of economic history, and I don't find the description true that this is the way economists do it when they do economic history, and historians, they do different things. There are more pluralism in that sense. There's more different approaches in history than in sociology, I think. But that comes from that it has to be. Some people are studying more the political processes. Some people are studying more slavery, for example. There's been a lot of econometric work on slavery. Some people are studying other things. And I think it is, in my view, it is the questions that dictate what kind of method it is. If it isn't, then it's really wrong. But some questions require a certain method. And if the question is precise enough, then it almost gives you the method that you have to use. It doesn't mean that you are successful in applying it, but it's the question that drives research. That is not always the case, but this good research is at least what I clap my hands for, is like that. So I wouldn't say that. I think it was exactly the same type of criticism that it was more political in the 70s. That was because people were more political, and I think that was an advantage, not a disadvantage actually, for the criticism, because it was much more real-world oriented criticism. It was about the Vietnam War. Who are the economists that discuss Vietnam War in a sense that was possible to understand? And these things are economic activities. At least they have economic implications and economic reasons behind these things. To understand conflict and war, 80% of the countries in Africa have had at least 1 year of civil war since 1980. But you can't just say that these are not economic things, that other people should discuss that. This is the real world that you're going to discuss. This is Africa. Many people live there. The majority in the world live in Asia. A lot of places in Asia have no credit. They have no infrastructure. They have very little of many things. This is the things we also should study. And I'm involved in a huge research on when girls get bicycle in Bihar in India, the consequences of that. Of course, this is economics at the core, I would say, that affect people's life. And these problems that people have, where you have little resources, are more important than the problems that people have, where you have a lot of resources. So I disagree to the whole description of what it is. The reason why I mentioned the political attitude of those who were core people in the general equilibrium theory, that they didn't believe in the description of the model. They want to solve certain things, and maybe given their different political starting point, they wanted to use the model right or wrong, for certain purposes. But that is the way you have to ask, what were the questions, what were the answers? Not look in itself, or the method is interesting only partially, I would say.
But can I ask you, do you think some of the critique is that there's too much math and too much formal models in economic theory? Do you agree to that?
Yes, I agree to that. I agree to this too little description. Economists have very little training in describing the world. I agree to these guys in that sense. The math was much more pronounced in the 70s. There were a branch of economics that were called mathematical economics. Nobody would call themselves mathematical economists today because everybody uses math. So, and as a consequence, the mathematics in today's economics are much more, I would say, non-fat modeling. That means that they are simpler things. They are not so general. They're not searching for mathematical generality. They are searching for mathematical specificness, or whatever it's called in English. That means that you can have very clear conclusion, and it's often meant as illustrations.
Okay, I want to ask you, Cahal, in your book, one of your main points is that the language is too technical, and that means also that common people cannot kind of be part of a debate about the economy. But don't you think that also this is a kind of that it requires some kind of skill sets to discuss complicated economic relationships, and if we take down the kind of technical skills, that we become less precise about some important relationships?
Well, I can't remember who it was. I think it might have been Einstein who said if you can't describe it to your grandmother, then you don't understand it. And so I think the role for economists really is to take these technical concepts, and they can discuss amongst themselves in those terms, absolutely. You know, jargon is necessary in a lot of cases, but they need to be able to communicate and engage with ordinary people using ordinary language. And I think any economist worth their salt should be able to do that.
Okay, I think we should also take some questions from the audience. So you can...
or comments.
Or comments. Comments or questions, and you can just raise your hand and say your name and ask question to whoever. Anyone want to be the first? Yes?
Hello, I am Gro Ladegård from the University of Life Sciences in Ås. We have a school of economics there, and we have a lot of developmental economics. And I will agree with you. But my problem is also that the economic debate in Norway, in the media, the politicians, when they discuss how to shape and change the economy, they use these words, you know? And they take some very basic economic theory for granted. And they say, okay, we make these policy decisions based on this very, very simple basic economic theory that some of us who know a little bit about economics know it will not work. But it's about the language that is used in public, kind of, that is not taking into account this more complex world of economics. And I don't know if economists have any responsibility in this, but I think they have.
Comment on that, Kalle? Do you
think the economists is blamed for everything? So this is just so we are so used to it, so that it doesn't matter. I think very often that I've been a couple of times, maybe more, in this Diskusjonsleder, and very often it's not those participants sitting around the table that are most technical, but those who introduce the topic themselves. And for example, there are way too much numbers. That I say that the numbers in Diskusjonsleder, they are so confusing that if you eliminated 1 or 2 zeros from the numbers, that people wouldn't recognize it. And then you don't need numbers. If you can divide by 100, and people are equally happy about what they said. So I think you're right. There should be much more discussion on mechanism and much more try to explain things in a simple way. I remember the first time somebody explained to me what devaluation was. I was into a shop selling motorbikes, and it was the seller explained. I was an economist at that time, but he wanted to sell me a bike, and he was going to explain the consequences of devaluation. It was a very good but very different explanations. So people are not stupid, and they turn, of course, on a different station when very few people listen to this kind of debates. So you are right. I think I've been a lot in unions, local unions around in the Oslo area, and they have a very deep understanding of social questions and economic questions. They are very good, and they don't use the same language. So I think we can learn a lot. So I think this is two ways learning, and then you don't have to only to speak about it. You have to be there. And so I feel a little bit irritated with the criticism, because it's never who talks to whom. At least if you're interested in criticizing people for not talking to others, then you should ask how many presentations did you give last year? How many unions were you talking to? And one year had 51 union meetings for a whole year, and I just become a little bit irritated. They're not curious about it. Then I think it is a little bit rethinking economics for its own sake. Now I'm a little bit harsh, so I invite these guys to increase the temperature.
Okay, I think you were first.
Yes, can I ask one of you to comment on his comment that your criticism is not precise enough to be wrong?
What the criticism?
I don't think that's...
I didn't say criticism. I say that the alternative models are very often precise enough, not precise enough to be wrong, but they could be good for...
Are you saying that they are not presenting any models, just criticizing what you say?
I didn't think about them in particular, but they should answer themselves.
I understood it in the same way. He was saying that the benefit of these mathematical models is that they are so precise that you can test them. But I mean, when it comes to macroeconomics, for example, this has not been the case at all. You've had a lot of theories that have never been tested, and they're not meant to be tested because they're falsified all the time, right? So I don't know. That's sort of a related answer.
I think we had some more questions, yes?
My name is Cahal Moran. I'm an economist from University of Oslo, as Kalle is. I would ask you to clarify something for me, which I think is part of the discussion.
Me.
One is, if you look at the list of Nobel Prize winner in economics, there is a huge diversity. You're pleading for diversity, so we can agree that in the economics field there are a lot of very interesting studies and people who are doing various things. What we think is addressing is the way we teach economics, as particularly the very standardized macro and micro stuff that has been more and more sort of converging toward one standard. And I think we can also say that there is a certain way of teaching that has become dominant, at least at some schools. And somebody knows about this DSGE school, which is a special form of general equilibrium modeling. But I think it's fair to say that part of that school has become dominant at many universities, and that is part of what the students are reacting to. So I don't think we get a dialogue if we say that there is a lot of interesting scientific work going on by you and others. What we need to discuss is, are we teaching economic students the best method that they can get in order to face real world subjects?
I think this is a fair point, and I agree to most of the things that you said, but I have to relate to the teaching that I know about. I know about my own teaching. I know about teaching to close colleagues, Halvor Melum, excuse me, Halvor Melum. I actually worked for Halvor Lerøy, and this when I was a kid working in the fishing industry in Bergen, so that's why the name sticks. So sorry. I know about teaching a close friends, and sometimes I go to listen to their teaching, to learn sometimes, and to discuss afterwards. We do a little bit in the small groups of people, and they are of course a selected group because we are friends and we work together. But it doesn't fit what you're saying, what they teach. Halvor is teaching macroeconomics. I remember the students, you said that there was no teaching, no mention of the financial crisis. The student that Halvor had, they said that it was good, it was a good course, but maybe it was too much on the financial crisis. So I think it's just unfair that they, why not, could you just say that there are a little bit diversity? Why have to say this is a hugely exaggerated picture? But I agree completely to this, that there's a dominance in part of macroeconomics, but not complete dominance. There are some people with different attitudes. And I shouldn't be the judge to say what is right and wrong here, but I think it's good that they try out certain things. But the name here is rethinking economics, and so it is not only teaching. But I agree that teaching, that is the critical thing. This is the Achilles heel. So we should start by broadening up. Larger courses, more discussion. Sometimes you should teach with offering pizza to students and talk to them and hear what they are saying. And I think there are elements of this, and therefore I think it's a little bit unfair that this stereotyping of the economics profession. When I was a student, I had teachers who were very broadly oriented. I can't believe that they had disappeared completely after that. We had a lot of different views in the teaching, and we were students at the same time at the same university, and we come from Bergen, both of us.
Okay, we take at least 2 more questions of Steve Keen, and that's more. Yeah.
What I find fascinating is that economists can still think general equilibrium is really cool. General economics is not cool. General equilibrium is a really interesting 19th century technology, which was disproven in 1899 by Poincaré, and economics has been ossified into the idea that general means equilibrium. General, these things means dynamic complex systems which operate far from equilibrium. And the very choice of an equilibrium framework means you can't even begin to analyse those dynamics. Now, if they're actually the dynamics of capitalism, students are wasting their time learning general equilibrium.
Do you comment that?
So I meant I didn't mean general equilibrium in the narrow sense, as you say. I just said that I think my ideal general equilibrium is where certain things fit together in the sense that they have adjusted to. Shut up! Where institutions change, where policy change, where these things, and that's, for example, you will never see, for example, very aggressive unions and the Keynesian policies together, because they don't fit. They are not in institutional equilibrium to each other. If you have a Keynesian policies, then the unions will just reap the benefits of that, and everything will go to the insiders. So that is what I meant by that. But I think these things should be viewed in the light of the problem that you are discussing. And I don't believe in sort of axiomatic claims that this is all out or this is all wrong by itself. I'm much more eclectic myself, but that's why we differ, I guess. And there are much more pluralism even between you and me in that.
Espen?
Yeah, Espen Moen from Norwegian Business School. So I know I will sound a bit pedantic now, but I cannot help it. I have to say something. And when I listen to you, particularly when I listen to Roman, but both of you, I was very fascinating in the beginning when you're setting up things and open up for criticism. But then when you give the examples, then I think this is not fair. This is really not fair. So when you talk about financial frictions, saying that sort of economists don't care about that. It's true that maybe didn't care that much about it before the financial crisis. You had Bernanke and others doing work on it, but it wasn't central. And then after the financial crisis, there have been so many papers on financial frictions and financial problems that I think the marginal benefit of those studies now is quite low. So also talking about DSGE models and saying that sort of you have methodological individualism is hopeless because looking at only only one individual or identical individuals. Well, that was what we were able to handle in our models earlier on. But if you go to a conference now, I mean, heterogeneous agent models is all over the place. That's what you see all the time. So again, this has to do with, this has to do with scientific progress to a large extent. So, and finally, which I think is also very strange, sort of this talking about equilibrium, and talk as if equilibrium and stability is the same. It's not. I mean, those of you who have seen the solid model, you know that you have this, that you have an equilibrium path to the stable path. That's very different things. So of course you can have equilibrium models where you study shock and you are out of steady state. You are mixing those two words. So what I would like to hear is sort of more specific alternatives. What do you have in mind when you say that you shall have other kinds of economics? Is it just to import history into economics? But why can't we then just have it in history and they do their things and we do our things? You talk about sort of these terrible mathematical models. So what is it that is so terrible with it? What it is one way of it's sort of logic. It's condensed logic. Of course, we have to use logic. And is it so much easier to do these problems without mathematics? I'm not sure at all. So it would be it's very much easier to criticize than to give a constructive alternative. That would be very nice to see.
You will answer this. I just had one more question, I think, so we'll take that one as well, and then you can both comment.
I'd like to say just three things briefly to that when it comes to alternatives.
Okay, if you just have one more question, and then you can, so.
I think he's excited with this. Of course, there is a lot of criticism to criticize the economics. I think
Speak up. Raise your voice. Speak up.
Okay. It would have great value if you are more specific on your measure of success. I mean, if you read the top journals today, 70% of the published work is about explaining the data. That is really about explaining the real world. You know, so that would be my measure of success. But you would say that that is not good enough.
I think Roman and Cahal should answer or comment.
Just firstly to that, so when it comes to alternatives, there are many other schools of thought, post-Keynesian economics, institutional economics, feminist economics, ecological economics, Austrian economics, and the list is very long. So there are many, and for example, Steve Keen, who's sitting there, is a prominent post-Keynesian economics who has done very good work particularly on financial crisis. So these alternatives exist. When it comes to, I want to underline just again, like Carl said before, that this is not about saying that methodological individualism is a bad principle. It's not about saying equilibrium is always wrong or mathematics is always wrong. It's about when that has its shortcomings, and when you need to use the other approaches. So that's the basic message. When it comes to, yes, there's been a lot of development within the discipline. When we mention, for example, financial frictions, I think a lot of this is still within the same framework. So just to be a bit blunt, you know, it's a bit like, yeah, we have this flat Earth theory, and we can make that compatible with the Earth revolving around the Sun, but maybe it's better to discard the flat Earth theory altogether. When it comes to the empirical turn, I think that is very valuable and something we should embrace, and that's a good thing. Economics is now more about testing data, but it also has some of these problems when it comes to a formalist discipline. So that's a different discussion, I think.
Okay, Cahal.
Okay, I mean, if you want an example of an alternative theory, a particular example, you were talking about the financial crisis and saying since the financial crisis, economists have been looking at financial frictions. Well, okay, that's great, but I'd rather they were looking at them before the financial crisis so they could have actually warned about it. Now, one guy who wouldn't have been admitted to a mainstream economics department was Hyman Minsky. And in 1980, he was writing about how finance can gradually become unstable because investors become overconfident and begin to bet more and more on rising asset prices. And if you just read some Minsky, if Ben Bernanke had read some Minsky, then they would have been far more alert to this idea of the great moderation and that just because inflation and unemployment were okay, everything was going to be okay. So that's just an example of the value, really, of pluralism and of having other ideas. And I mean, the simple question, I think it's come down to people saying, you know, there's there's a lot of good research here. This is what you're saying. You know, this isn't the way I do it. There's a lot of good research here and there. We don't disagree. But what we're saying, and we have evidence to back this up, you know, as I said, we did a curriculum review at the Russell Group universities. The general thrust of economics is as we've described it, and there is good work in economics, but there is just so much on the mainstream models, equilibrium, and without really any critical thinking. And so, I mean, the simple question you have to ask is, on most mainstream courses and in most mainstream economic journals, could Hyman Minsky have been published? And the answer is no. He couldn't have.
Okay, Kalle said I oversaw one hand up here, so if it's a very short question, then yeah.
If you speak up, you know. Good.
My understanding was that the discourse was about the shift from dogma to some kind of debate. But what I picked is that perhaps economics is useful as a method. Is that an attractive position?
Here. Is economics useful as a method? Is economics useful as a method?
Is it?
Okay, can you?
I think the answer is yes. And I once wrote a little article called "Nice Voice, Wrong Tune," and I think the voice in this analogy is some of the method, the tools that you have, but then you have to raise the important questions. That is what kind of tunes you are playing with the instrument. And I think that you can see it again and again, that these methods are not as restrictive as many people think, but they should be enriched. And they should definitely be enriched by better descriptions. And there also, when you have better descriptions, then you also have, they call it the study of the real world. I can agree to that. If you have more of sort of inputs to that, then you also have better questions to raise, and you can use the methods for that. I thought I said too much, I guess.
Well, thank you so much, Kalle Moene, Roman Eliassen, and Cahal Moran. And so I hope you've been wiser, or maybe not. There will be some coffee now outside, and we begin again 1:45.